Just before we start part 3, I'd like to thank you all for listening and thanks for all the comments and feedback. We've got some new artwork for part 3 from the talented Florence Friggins, and I'm really excited about the ending because doing the podcast has actually changed how the story ended because of the way it's moved with the sound and the whole swirl of the gyre. So here we go, part 3. Bea walked into the bedroom of the hotel suite and found GYRE Each packing a rucksack with one hand and holding a noodle sandwich with the other. "Where's Julie?" she said. GYRE spoke with his mouth full of noodles. "Gone." "Gone? Gone where?" "Security have flown over to the village." "What? Why?" "Security, precaution. There's been a blast on Triton. Quite a lot of damage, but it's okay. They're moving us to the village. Julie's gone ahead. We'll meet her there, then we'll all fly back to Triton together. But first..." Bea cut him off. "Why did no one tell me? What's the situation on Triton?" GYRE swallowed his mouth full of noodles and said, "I'm telling you, it's nothing to worry about. It doesn't look state-sponsored." "You mean it was an attack, not an accident? Triton was attacked?" "It looks that way." Bea turned to go. "I have to get hold of the comms team, find out what's happening." GYRE called her back. "No need. They've got everything under control. They said the damage was limited, and besides, there's something I want to show you." When they left their hotel suite, the corridor was empty and silent. There was no noise at all. Not even from the street outside. GYRE hurried Bea along to the lift, which took them all the way down to the lower basement. GYRE pressed the button that had no number or letter on it and held it for a few seconds before releasing it. The lift slowly moved down to the next floor below. The doors opened into a concrete bunker. Narrow corridors lit by emergency lighting fed off into small rooms packed with metal shelving units filled with tin produce, medical supplies and blankets. GYRE marched on as Bea took it all in. They came to a sealed rim door that looked like an airlock on a sub. GYRE punched in the combination and the door's mechanism began to unlock. He looked at Bea and smiled. "Nearly there," he said. They went through the doorway into a small chamber that opened into an underground car park. The car park was empty except for one Land Rover. GYRE pressed his hand on the driver's door window and the door slid open. He threw his rucksack in the back and jumped into the driver's seat. "Come on then," he said. Bea looked around. "Are you driving?" GYRE nodded. "Yes, of course." "But you don't know how to drive. You've never driven anything in your life." GYRE shrugged. "How difficult can it be?" They took the ramp and drove off at speed, out of the car park, then down the wide, empty streets. As the city flashed past, Bea was thinking about the attack on Triton, how quickly things had turned sour after the conference, how quickly things can escalate. GYRE said, "They evacuated the city this morning. Well, some people left, others went underground. But we'll be all right, don't worry. It's more about what we might catch from them than the other way around. That's what all those injections and decompression was for, protection." "Protection against what?" Bea said. "What the hell's going on?" "Just overreaction. Once one person panics, it soon spreads. One person starts to say crazy things, and before you know it, everyone runs for the hills." "You mean people panicked about you, about us?" We noted that this was the first time Bea used the term us to include herself in the gyre. Bea began to breathe rapidly in short bursts. She was beginning to panic. She was too far away for us to reach out to her, to help her, to calm her. GYRE opened the window. "You need some fresh air," he said. Bea turned to the open window and felt the blast of air against her face. They drove without bothering what side of the road they were supposed to be on. They drove without bothering about stoplights. When they saw flashing lights up ahead and military vehicles blocking the way, GYRE screeched to a halt and turned around. "Maybe we'll find another way out." Bea tried to contact the ops team and then the security team, but no one replied. GYRE said, "Everyone's gone to the village. It's a designated secure site." Don't worry, we'll get there soon. We've just got to make a little detour first. They drove into the scrublands at the edge of the city. Gyre pulled up by a broken chain fence. He picked up his rucksack, left the Land Rover and went through the fence. Bea ran after him. They began walking through what looked like an abandoned construction site. Huge concrete drainage pipes lay broken on the ground. The scrubland gave way to trees and dense bushes. They climbed a hill and looked out over a valley completely covered in dense forest. They watched the branches and leaves sway in the breeze like waves on the ocean. "Wow," Bea said. It had been so long since she'd seen any trees or anything green. Gyre Each smiled at her and said, "I know, pretty amazing, huh?" The sun was hot and high in the sky. Bea could hear insects buzzing everywhere. She swiped at the flies that were gathering round her head. None seemed to be bothering Gyre. He passed her a water bottle, then shielded his eyes to scan the horizon. "Which way is it?" he said. Bea took a glug of the water and said, "Which way is what?" She wiped the sweat from her brow and out of her eyes. Gyre opened the rucksack and took out a sandwich. He passed one to Bea, but she waved it away. "Just say which direction you think it is," he said. She looked around, then pointed without thinking too much, hoping that would keep him happy. He smiled. "And what is it that's in that direction?" She was about to say the first thing that popped into her head when, very quietly, she thought she heard waves rolling in on a pebbled shoreline. She saw in her mind's eye a white stretch of beach and a glistening turquoise sea. Gyre laughed and began eating his sandwich. They set off in the direction she'd pointed. Once they got down into the forest, the air was cooler. Gyre strode ahead. He didn't wait for Bea to catch up. He didn't wait. Bea gave up thinking about how much her feet hurt and how tired her legs were. This was a different ache, a different pain to the ailments associated with connecting to the gyre. This was the ache and the pain of sheer physical exertion. It took all her concentration to navigate through the low branches and undergrowth. They didn't stop till it got too dark to see properly, and they both started tripping over tree roots and bumping into branches. The den they made was just big enough for the two of them. They were safe and perfectly hidden from view. Bea lay on the soft earth and felt herself seep into the ground. Her body was exhausted. She shrank away from the outer world and travelled down into the roots and shoots and grubs beneath her. Her body slowly turned and stretched like it was floating on an invisible ocean current. Her dreams came flooding back to her on the ebb and flow of the tide. In her dream, she was back on Triton. There were so many things she'd forgotten, projects that needed chasing, meetings she'd missed. She heard people rushing past her office and down the corridor. No one was usually up on this floor. No one rushed along the corridor. She jumped up from her desk and ran out to see what was going on. Before she realised what was happening, she joined in the group pushing and jostling each other to get out on deck. There was a terrible banging coming from the lower decks of Triton. It reverberated through the metal walls and up through the floors. A crowd had gathered at the black railings, looking down into the waves. Bea realised she hadn't put her shoes on. She stared at her bare feet, pale, next to the steel grey of the deck. Her eye was drawn to the fine hairs on each toe. She worried someone might stand on her toes and crush them. She carefully edged her way through the crowd to see what was going on. A whale was throwing itself at the side wall of Triton. The crowd cried out with each sickening thud. The orca would swim at Triton like a torpedo, crash into the wall, get knocked back, then swim around and charge again. The impact made her wince. Why was it doing that? She was shouting with everyone else. She was shouting, "Stop!" Then the sea turned a sparkling bright blue and the orca swam away at high speed towards the shore. Bea woke with her heart thumping in her chest. She peered through the branched walls of their den to see if there was any light yet. Her tears came easily. She wiped them from her cheeks and looked at the beautiful sleeping face of GYRE Each. She told Sam about the whale. She didn't know what else to do. She asked Sam what she thought a dream like that might mean. Even though Sam hadn't been with them since they left Triton, Bea could still hear Sam's voice in her head. Sam said, "The whale is going to desperate lengths to get your attention. The bare feet, obviously, your natural animal state, no trappings of civilization, exposed and vulnerable." Bea replied, "I'm not sure, maybe it's not that literal. I think it might be more symbolic, not necessarily logical or decipherable." "Okay," Sam said. "What did you feel when the whale was bashing itself against the side of Triton?" Bea knew that not all the conversations she had with Sam were real conversations. Some of them were like the conversation she was having right now. She stroked strands of hair from GYRE's face as he slowly awoke. He smiled at her with an expression that could only be described as Buddha-like. He yawned and stretched, and she felt the vibrancy of his youthful body charge up as if an electric current was passing through it. They ate the last of their food supplies and set off through the forest. When a sudden ferocious downpour came, GYRE ran around, leaping and hooting. The rain passed as quickly as it arrived and was replaced by the blazing hot sun. GYRE rubbed the rain into his skin like it was a healing balm. He closed his eyes and smelt his wet skin. He looked up as the sunlit raindrops fell on his face from the shiny green leaves. He traced his hand along the dark brown rain streaks that ran down the tree trunks and pressed his face against the bark, taking in as much of the smell as he could. He'd never seen trees before and probably never would again. "This is what I wanted to show you," he said. Bea looked around. "Trees? Aren't these the trees you saved?" GYRE said. It took her a moment to trace where GYRE's mind had jumped, and she explained, "Those trees were in another country, another continent, another century. And anyway," she added, "we tried to save them, but we failed. They all got chopped down, the river got diverted, and they built their bypass." GYRE looked up at the treetops. "No matter," he said. "Our brothers and sisters are grateful for your efforts." "That's nice of them," Bea laughed. "You're talking to trees now, are you?" "Of course," he said, and took a deep breath. "I've never met a tree till now, but we do share a common ancestor somewhere way back. One organism chose to turn oxygen into carbon dioxide, one chose to do the reverse. Almost like we're two bodies or branches of the same entity, and soon the next GYRE gen will be able to generate their own energy without needing to eat plants or animals. It's like we're completing the circle. It's like..." Bea was exhausted. She said, "GYRE." "Yes?" "Shut up." They set off walking again, and GYRE seemed oblivious to her exhaustion. He stepped up his pace, eager to get to the ocean. The forest turned into a marsh and then a bog. When Bea fell flat on her face, she was ready to just lay down in the coal black mud and sink. She somehow got up on her hands and knees and felt the seeping slime close around her. She didn't have the breath to shout for GYRE. She got herself back on her feet and tore one leg out of the bog and plunked it down. She had to keep on heaving one heavy leg after another, whilst making sure she didn't lose her balance and fall over again. When the ground hardened, she paused to get her breath back. She couldn't see GYRE and had no idea which way he'd gone. It was now too dark to make out any shape other than the thin strip of light blue sea on the horizon, a horizon which didn't seem to be getting any closer. She stumbled and lurched onwards till her body collapsed and she passed out. The village was a number of wooden huts that had once been a fishing village on an atoll that wasn't much more than a sandbar with some palm trees and jagged rocks at one end. The village and the atoll had been taken over by the military, and there was still evidence of the surveillance facility they'd built. But both the fishing village and the military base were abandoned, which gave the perfect place for the ops and security teams to regroup and get ready to fly back to Triton. Bea had been picked up where she'd collapsed in the swamp, only a few kilometres from the secure extraction point. She was lying on a low bed made of woven dried reeds. When she came round, she saw Julie's lined face smiling at her. "You okay?" Julie said. "I think so." Bea lifted herself up to look around. "Where am I?" "Safe," Julie said, then flicked her head towards the door. "Gyre's swimming." She paused and looked back at Bea. "Take your time. We're not going anywhere in a hurry." While Bea recovered, Julie fed her soup and cigarettes and stayed close by her side. Bea was desperate to get up and speak to the ops team to find out what was happening on Triton, but Julie said, "Your orders are to rest, so lie there and tell me about Jay." Bea told her how she'd met Jay on the protest camp, how they'd moved up into the trees. "I got brought down," she said, "but Jay held on till the bitter end." Julie chuckled. "That's my boy." Then she began coughing her smoker's rasping cough. That's what he was like as a baby. He'd be sat in his nappies, blocking the entrance to the RAF base, stopping those huge trucks with nuclear missiles on. Proper little rebel. Bea told her about the Drove and the community they'd built, the community that became the Corps. Julie listened with glowing admiration. Bea could see how proud she was, but just at the edge of her smiling eyes she saw the sadness that she'd missed out on it all. Julie muttered something underneath her breath while Bea studied the lines on her face. Without looking at Bea, she said, "You know what I did, don't you? Why I was in prison?" "Yeah," Bea said, and waited. Julie took a huge intake of breath and sighed. "It's good to hear all about you and Jay. That's all we ever wanted. We wanted change, everyone did. We didn't like what the system did to us, how it shaped us, how it made us feel. I've had a lot of time to think about it, but you know, when I was young, I thought I was old. It was like time was running out. We had to do something. Does that make sense?" Julie looked at Bea for reassurance. Bea nodded. Julie looked away. "What I did, it was a terrible thing, and I've often thought, knowing what I know now, would I do the same again?" She glanced at Bea. Bea said, Can I ask you about the bean field?" "Jay said he saw you being dragged through a broken window by your hair." "Did he?" Julie shook herself. "Well, yes, that did happen, but it didn't happen to me. The bean field was bad as it gets. It was frenzied. It was like the cops were possessed. I shielded Jay from as much of it as I could." Julie seemed lost in her memories that suddenly re-emerged like a dead body being washed up on the beach. "It must have been terrifying for the little lad," she said. "Jay was big, but I think on the inside he was always a little lad." She smiled at Bea. "Did you love him?" Bea reeled back. "Yeah, I did. I really did. And he loved me." Julie placed her hands around Bea's hands. "Well, at least you had that," she said. "It must have been hard, losing him like that, losing someone you loved when you were so young." Bea felt Julie anchor her as tears burst forth and flooded her cheeks. Julie wiped Bea's tears away and held her. When Jay drowned, it was like Bea always knew that would happen, like he was only supposed to be here for a short time and then he'd go back to whichever world he was visiting from. From the moment he'd first appeared at the road protest camp, she couldn't believe he was just there, right in front of her in plain sight, and no one seemed to think this was miraculous. When she asked people who he was, they just said, "Oh, that's Jay," like it was normal, but it was anything but normal. To Bea, it was like the trees themselves had conjured up this mythical beast, brought him forth and made him manifest to aid them in their noble quest to stop the bypass and save the trees. It was the same when she saw him at the farm, just chopping wood like it was the most normal thing in the world. But to Bea, it was magical, or as close to magic as she'd ever been. When they found his body, when the flood waters receded, they cremated him, and she took his ashes with her to Triton and built a shrine for him within the core. It was a year to the day since they'd lost Kid Gyre. Lost at sea meant they wouldn't find the body, his body, and that's what broke Bea. Bea was partway through a staged review of operations when the head of security knocked on her door. If they'd realised it was a year to the day, perhaps they'd have chosen a better time to ask her about the string of complaints that had piled up. She'd shouted at just about everyone, but now she'd hit one of the senior researchers, pushed him over in fact. The head of security planned to just have a quiet word to see if they could calm the waters and stop the researcher from pressing charges. But instead, Bea smashed up her office before collapsing in a heap on the floor, sobbing. It was described as a retreat, as rehab. She was taken to the White Room. Her days were spent sleeping, eating and exercising with no human contact. She could only talk to Sam. After a month, she was allowed to work for part of her day in food production. In the climate-controlled light chambers, she tended to the plants and monitored their output data. She made sure they got the right nutrients. She was encouraged to talk to the plants in soft, cooing tones. It was classed as light duties. Sam helped her reconstruct her memories. Sam said, "You're only remembering the memory from last time. And that's only a memory of what you remember from the time before that. It's not what actually happened. You can control what you remember and what you don't. We can help you choose better options." After 2 more weeks, Sam said she could go back to her accommodation. She kept working at the food plant and began to take on a few of her more regular duties as director of operations. Sam said she could start mixing with people again, but she hadn't. It was early in the morning, first light, just before the dawn, and the security team were rushing around the island. Bea grabbed one of them to find out what was going on. He showed her the latest news footage. A thick plume of smoke was billowing up into the sky from a stretch of the ocean. "What is it?" she said. "There's been an airstrike overnight. They've hit Triton." Bea held on to the security officer. She gripped his arm a little too tightly. "What?" she said. "I mean, who? What happened?" "We got most of the people off, but there are a few casualties, nothing fatal. They've all been flown to a hospital on the mainland." Bea let go of his arm and composed herself for a moment. "Show me the footage again," she said. She looked at the smoke and wreckage in the waves. "So how bad is the damage?" The security officer shrugged. "It's pretty much sunk without trace." Bea suddenly realised what that meant. "And what about the gyre?" she said. The security officer nodded his head towards the shoreline. "He's over there." Bea looked and saw Gyre Each wading through the waves. "No, But she stopped herself. She saw on the security officer's face that to him, Gyre Each was the gyre. She realised that to everyone, the gyre began and ended with Gyre Each. Her knowledge of us, her understanding of and connection with us, is best kept to herself. "Yes," she said. "Okay, well, his safety has to be our top priority from now on. Does he know that Triton's gone?" "No, it only happened a few hours ago." "Okay, well, let's keep it that way for now. The less he knows, the better. I'll break it to him when the time's right." The security officer stiffened. "Whatever you say, I'll let the ops team know." Bea looked at Gyre Each diving through the waves. He saw her and smiled, waving his arms for her to join him. She saw him as a child in a man-sized body, just an ordinary boy who'd painted his skin green. Gyre Each spent all his time on the atoll swimming in the sea. At night, he made himself a fire on the beach and searched the heavens for the moon they would explore on the distant planet Neptune. He relentlessly nagged, cajoled and emotionally blackmailed Bea to join him for a swim, till eventually she gave in. She thought going for a swim might be the best way to tell him about Triton. The blue sky and palm trees were a picture-perfect tropical paradise. The morning was the only time Bea could stand being out. By lunchtime the heat was so intense it felt dangerous. Gyre ran and dived into the waves. Bea walked in up to her knees. The sea was crystal clear and as warm as a bath. Inch by inch and step by step she surrendered to the water. As she swam with Gyre, his infectious laugh made her feel buoyant and carefree. With a snorkel, face mask and fins, she could dip under the surface and swim down to the shallow seabed to see the glory of the shoals of brightly coloured fish all darting around. Gyre guided her along the seabed to where the sloping shelf suddenly dropped to a much deeper, murkier expanse of water. She felt the temperature drop as they swam down. Gyre caught her attention and signalled to see if she was okay. She gave him the thumbs up, and he waved to her to follow him as he began to ascend. They broke the surface with a loud clatter as they gasped for air, and the two of them shrieked like seagulls. As they bobbed in the gentle waves treading water, Gyre checked that she was okay, then explained that thumbs up meant you want to go up to the surface. He showed her the way to signal okay if she was okay, making a circle with his finger and his thumb. You ready to go back down? Bea thought about starting the conversation, to tell him Triton had sunk without trace, but she couldn't bear his boyish smile being broken. She nodded and gave him the correct OK signal. He took her through the breathing pattern to ready herself for a deeper dive. Hold that last breath like you're tying off a balloon, he said. Then he clipped a rope onto her and secured the other end to his belt. Ready? He said. She gave the OK. Gyre dived down with such speed and force she felt like she'd been attached to a torpedo. She felt the cold close round her as they dived deeper and the water got darker. It felt like she was returning to some womb-like state, being pulled along by Gyre on an umbilical cord. She'd given birth to him, and now he was reciprocating. Gyre slowed his dive and turned to hold her arms. He nodded and gave her the OK. They came to a rest on the seabed and looked at each other again. Gyre signalled for her to listen, but she couldn't hear anything. He tapped his head and wagged his finger, telling her not to think, then tapped his ear again. He reached out and held her face. She looked into his face mask, searching his eyes for meaning, and waited. She couldn't hear anything. Gyre looked away to where the sound was coming from. Then when his face turned back, as soon as she saw it, she tried to get away, but he held her tight and wouldn't let her go. She thrashed like a fish caught in a net. She couldn't look. He held her face in his vice-like grip. He made her look at him. His face had changed into the face of Kid Gyre. It was Kid Gyre looking back at her from the face mask. As she struggled and fought against him, her heart began to pound in her ears, and she lost control of her breathing. She was panicking and hitting against him to get herself free. Gyre dragged her at speed to the surface and thrust her head out of the water. She coughed and spluttered. Gyre called over one of the patrol boats and they hauled her out of the water. As she landed on the deck in a heavy wet lump, she tore her shoulder. The ligaments round her ball and socket joint stretched, but without snapping. In the old days, they would have snapped and taken weeks, if not months, to heal. She lay there twitching like a landed fish. Gyre helped her crawl to the side of the boat, where she puked up the seawater she'd swallowed. Then she collapsed and curled up into a ball. When the boat came ashore, Gyre picked her up and carried her back to the hut, where he watched over her to make sure she didn't drown in her own vomit. When she was lucid, he asked her what had made her bolt like that. She couldn't say. She could only remember waking up in the hut. Julie assured Gyre it was okay. Leave her with me. She needs to rest. I'll look after her. Bea remembered swimming in the morning in the bright sun. She remembered seeing all the coloured fish. Julie said, "Do you remember diving down to the seabed with Gyre?" "I remember the cold gripping round me like someone squeezing my legs." Gyre said he heard the sirens. "Do you remember hearing them?" "Sirens? No. You mean the patrol boat?" Julie laughed. "No, I mean the sirens of the sea. Gyre thinks they came for you. They tried to take you." Bea slept for a whole day. She drifted in and out of a delirious sleep. At one point she saw Julie kneeling on the floor with a bowl in front of her. The swirls of milky mist were spiralling up and forming into shapes. Julie was talking to someone, but Bea couldn't hear what she was saying. Then Julie was whispering in her ear, "Gyre Each was born on Triton, right? But he was conceived in this world. The rest of the Gyre were all conceived and born on Triton. What if they don't accept him back, now he's been with us? They'll see him as contaminated." When Bea woke, it was dark. Julie helped her sit up. "Well, you look better," she said. "Back to your old self." "Less of the old," Bea said, trying to smile. Julie brought her a cup of tea. "The boy Wonder has lit a big fire on the beach. We're all watching the rocket launch. It's a clear night, perfect conditions. They think we should get a pretty good view from here. Are you up for it?" Julie helped her up and waited for her to get dressed. She felt the pain in her shoulder where she'd torn it on the boat. She was remembering being with us in the Gyre. She was thinking about how to tell Gyre Each about Triton. The ops and security teams had all gathered on the beach to watch the rocket launch. The moon rose out of the sea and the sky filled with stars. The fire was already ablaze. Huge flames licked up into the sky. Sparks flew off into the night like rockets. A spark flew out of the fire and landed on Bea's arm. She knocked it away instantly, but it still left a burn that initially stung intensely, but then the pain subsided as quickly as it had begun. Some people were sat round the fire, others were scattered in groups along the beach. Everyone was drinking. Bea watched Gyre Each and Julie. They were so engrossed with each other they barely acknowledged her. Gyre Each was doing his best performance. Julie was giggling and laughing in all the right places. She was becoming enthralled by her grandson. Julie picked up a guitar and started singing. More people came over to listen. Gyre looked at her with eyes full of awe and wonder. Bea felt a sudden and intense surge of heat. We felt it too. We were getting closer. Soon she would hear our song. The heat of the fire became as unbearable as her internal heat. She was sweating, her face flushed beetroot red. We were close, but she was still just out of reach. Another inch, another step, and our fingertips would touch her. We'd be able to hold her again. She walked over to Julie and Gyre Each. "Just going for a stroll," she said. "Wait!" Gyre Each shouted. He was riding high on the attention from his grandmother. "It's nearly rocket time!" He mimed a rocket taking off. Julie laughed. "I won't be long," Bea said. Julie said, "Do you want me to come with you?" But Bea had already gone. The further away from the campfire she got, the calmer she felt. She breathed in the cool evening breeze that blew straight off the sea. The moonlight glistened and sparkled in each wave that rolled in and out. As Bea walked on the wet sand, she felt the cool air rush over her skin. She walked along the shore at just the right point so her bare feet were covered with each wave. Then she felt the sand drag beneath her toes as the wave receded. We feel this drag, this inevitable pull of purpose and destiny. She came to an outcrop of rocks and sat under a palm tree. She closed her eyes for a moment and let out a sigh. She sat for a long time, feeling perfectly calm and still. Gyre came over and sat behind her on the rocks in the shadows. She didn't turn round, she could just feel his presence. She was so pleased he decided to leave the fire and join her. "It was Kid Gyre," she said. That's what I saw when we were on the seabed. Your face turned into his face. She shuddered at the thought of it. The hairs prickled up on her arms and around the back of her neck. Gyre spoke to her. No one's to blame, it wasn't your fault. She felt a balloon pop inside her. Silent tears rolled down her bursting cheeks. But I let him go swimming. He'd been on at me for days, nagging me for weeks, she began sobbing. I told him it would be okay. Gyre said, It is okay. It's not your fault. We were all to blame. But I let him go with you. And you should have looked after him. He was just a kid. He was one of you. You never waited for him to catch up. She bent forward, crying in her hands. Her back began to shake. She wiped her face and wondered why GYRE Each hadn't put his arm round her. Why wasn't GYRE Each holding her, comforting her? Why wasn't he saying anything? She turned to look behind her and saw only the broken shadows of the moonlight on the rocks. She looked over at the fire and saw GYRE Each with Julie where he'd always been. She looked up into the sky at the stars, at the moon, then out to the horizon. She felt a soft breeze blow against her skin. She became mesmerized by the waves, the moonlight. Then she felt a twist, a turn, like a child's kaleidoscope turns and opens a new collage of images, a new perspective. Another twist, another turn, and the scene of the sea before her turned into a kaleidoscope of moonlit waves and dark ocean, fractured moons and stars. Her pupils dilated and then divided. She, all at once, saw an orca break the surface and blow air out of its blowhole, and in that moment, all at once, she saw a sub emerge out of the water right in front of her in the shape of a black dome. And in that moment, all at once, she saw Jay's head emerge out of the flood waters like an island of hope right in front of her. And in that kaleidoscopic fractured moment, she saw the whole of the gyre appear out of the waves right in front of her. The whole of the gyre were looking at her. The whole of the gyre were singing to her. We were all there finally. We had reached out and touched her. We reached her finally. She blinked and her vision returned to normal. The waves were all in one place. The moon and stars were back in the sky. She saw the orca's fin break the surface, then its tail, then it disappeared back into the black water. And there, right in front of her, was a black sub in the shape of a dome, just popping its head out of the water. We, the gyre, were there, and we were close enough to speak. We're here for you, Mother. We've come to collect you and return you to the Gyre Palace, all safe and sound. We sank to the bottom of the ocean, as we always intended to. We knew Triton was never designed to withstand such an attack from the outside world, but it was the sacrifice we had to make. We pored over the plans of Triton, the blueprints, and set about redesigning the core, so we could survive and thrive hidden in the Gyre Palace at the bottom of the sea. For the outside world, we no longer exist. They blew us up, destroyed Triton, and so we are safe once again to bring forth the next generation. Come now, Mother, and join us. We need you to help us grow and nurture the next gen. The Gyre babies will need their grandmother. Come now, Mother, come and join us. Bea looked over to the fire, the ops and security teams. She watched GYRE Each with his devoted Julie and knew everything would be okay. She began walking towards the water, but we said, "Not like this, Mother. You can leave your clothes behind. You don't need them now. They only held you back, restricted your freedom. Leave them behind and join us." Bea stripped off her clothes, folded them in a neat pile on the beach, then left them on the shore. She waded in up to her knees, then up to her hips, then began to swim towards the dome-like sub. It wasn't until the next morning, when they couldn't find her in her hut, that they began to search the island. They found her clothes neatly folded where she'd left them. They never found her body. You've been listening to The GYRE, written and produced by Quan Jin.